Welcome, Sonja. And thank you for your time for this interview for the Calm Mind series.
I'm Sonja Peteranderl. I'm the Latin American correspondent for Der Spiegel magazine. I'm currently based in Mexico, in Tijuana, the border city. And I'm covering political trends, society, organized crime, security politics, and migration in Latin America. I'm also the co-founder of BuzzingCities Lab. So my colleague Julia Jaroszewski and I founded a think tank, and we're analyzing and doing projects related to the impact of technology on security, on crime, on politics and political participation in informal settlements like favelas in Brazil or townships in South Africa. You could say that my family, like my parents, trained me to be the nomad I am because they moved me several times in my childhood. So basically from the north of Germany to the south of Germany, and later I moved back. Also, I think I was also always crazy for stories, crazy for learning new stuff. And I was reading all the time and basically also writing all the time. My family doesn't have an academical background, so I didn't really have a famous journalist in my family or something like that, and I think I didn't even know anyone who had this job. But yeah, I still loved stories, and I depicted myself basically sitting on a ranch in Spain, writing my books with a typewriter. I was just reading all the time. I think like many people, when they see the work that I do, and they're kind of surprised that I am so obsessed, you could say, or kind of like continue to follow trends like drugs, drug politics, addiction, violence, conflict, and so on. But I'm rather surprised how people cannot have any connections to these issues. Because I think even in my childhood, I think addiction played a role. I knew a lot of in my teenage years, I knew a lot of drug dealers and drug addicts. I knew people related to the mafia or to youth gangs.
In Germany?
In Germany, yeah. And that's another point. I think organized crime and all of these topics are a global topic. It's not something just related to developmental countries or something. It's just the matter or the questions if you open your eyes or if you don't. If you open your eyes, you can stop. You can go back basically, and you see these structures everywhere. Actually, I'm kind of a granny. I realized, I think this or last year, that I started journalism when I was 16, so it's over 2 decades. So I started to work for the local newspaper where I was living, and just started to cover local issues, from politics or party issues to party and clubbing and everything you can imagine. And in the last years I was working as a foreign correspondent, mostly freelance for national newspapers, international media platforms also. And then I worked for Wired magazine as an editor, a senior editor covering technology, but also trends like predictive policing, how the police uses algorithms or software to trying to track down criminals, identify criminals, and all the social problems and political problems related to this. And then I went on to work as a technology editor at Spiegel, and now switched again to working more globally in Latin America. I think like organized crime and also like violence are a mirror for society and also society's problems. As I said previously, not just somewhere in remote areas, but like all over the world. And basically like crime and also the criminal justice system, like those areas reflect how society is built. And also they reveal the flaws of societies, you know? Like the justice system is like full of flaws. New policing systems are, you know, like kind of like curbing racism very often. So, and also if you look at the structures, like crime is basically like everywhere in society, but white collar crime, you know, like money laundering on the higher level, or bank crimes are, you know, like less tracked down.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
basically you just have this like small part or a small image of crime that is seldom the whole picture. It's very hard to outline a regular day. It depends very much like on what kind of issues I'm working on. So basically like one day it could be like mostly scanning the news or talking to people online, kind of like catching up trends, reading news all over. And then like when I'm working basically like in the field, it could be like, you know, like just going out in the field, basically doing research on the border, interviewing migrants, interviewing other sources. Often, like when you work in, you know, like not really, like conflict areas or areas like of urban, basically like urban war, you need a lot of time because you need your sources have to trust you, basically. So very often it's just, you know, like starting with one person, just spending time with the person, trying to understand the environment, then you are passed on to other person. So it's very often a process. COVID-19 had a tremendous impact on, I think, like the work of journalists all over the world, because basically you could not, you know, like depending on the situation in the country you were working on, sometimes you couldn't even go to the streets anymore with the lockdowns. And also like basically you had to think about if you would become a risk for the communities you want to cover, you know. So on one hand it's really important to track down the situations, like to cover the situation on the ground, but on the other hand, like I don't want to infect basically like very vulnerable migrants, for example, or people in informal communities who often live in very dense and problematic environments, you know. It would be a lie if you would say like you are fearless. I think like everybody has a lot of fears. It's just maybe the level or the context is different. I'm kind of used to work in contexts of urban violence, like in areas where a shootout could occur, areas where you could get kidnapped, basically, stuff like that. And I think you, like with time, you become a scanner for your environment. Basically, you become more aware of the things, like, and even when I'm in Berlin or in European cities, you know, like I always wear my smartphone in my underwear. I always look around. Like you become a scanner for basically like situations or persons that kind of like, I wouldn't say like behave suspiciously, but you just like try to analyze everything. And this is kind of like, it becomes kind of a mindset. Of course, even for example, like if you have a shootout or something or a dangerous situation, and you also develop a feeling for situations that could like quickly change, for example, you have fear because you're threatened, right? But I think if you're kind of prepared for it and also like prepare yourself that it could happen, at least like your mind switches to kind of a survival mode or something. Like you still have to fear, but at the same time, very quickly you start to think about like, how can I get out of the situation? Where's the safest place to move, for example? So if you have kind of like, I think it can help, like, or at least reduce the risk if you think about what could happen before and what are you basically like, what are your options to act. Of course you do, because you always like basically you're influenced by who you are, how you act and so on. I think you probably like you have other threats working as a journalist in these environments, like talk to criminals and so on, talking to might be like corrupt, violent policemen or whatever, than men. And of course, like sexual violence, for example, would be an issue, right? Like if they kidnap you, you don't know what could happen. Like, on the other hand, sometimes it can help. Sometimes it can even help that you're underestimated as a, you know, like as a woman in these environments because they don't see you as a threat. Like if you work, or basically like if you work in an area like conflict area or something, or an area that's kind of like hit by organized crime, they might rather assume that you're a social worker or something than a threat for them, you know? So this could help. Sometimes also like when you cover, and they do, like oftentimes I also cover the situation of women or violence against women, you can unlock people differently or talk to people differently if you share experiences. I think like focusing like all the time on, you know, like kind of the dark sides, if you could call it like that, of society, it has an impact of you. Because like obviously you don't think that the world is, you know, a rose garden or something, you know, you really focus and you see it everywhere on the problematic sides, whether corruption, corrupt like structures, crime, violence and so on, social injustice. So I think it impacts you. I think the most disappointing aspect is that, like, I think like all the people who work in this area, like they have a mission, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. Because the price is really high, it's not really rewarding, you have a high personal risk, and it's not something that makes you really happy, you know? On the other hand, I think like what drives us, and I'm talking, you know, like about like this community of people like really wanting to cover and also like partly change things on the ground, is that I think it's important to look at the things and to raise awareness and attention in order to change them. And I think what drives me is very often like the small, you know, like the small stories of change. I know a lot of people who were, for example, like former gang members, and who, you know, like who exited the gang, who show that it's possible to live another life, you know, also with some support from the outside, and who nowadays like become part of the solution, basically, instead of being the problem, you know. I wouldn't say you get totally numb. There are other coping strategies, for example, like also in Latin American countries, and also like journalists become sometimes kind of cynical. I wouldn't say that I'm cynical, but you develop another, you know, like manner. You, for example, you make jokes about sometimes violence or murder, or it's a coping strategies. And sometimes even, you know, like in Mexico or other countries, like if there was a murder, like kids come together, people come together, eating popcorn on the crime scene and stuff like that. From the outside, it's hard to understand, but it's just, you know, like coping strategy, I would say. And but I wouldn't say that you get totally used to everything. Like,
So if
brutal
you,
violence is still shocking. When I came back from Juarez, from Ciudad Juarez, border city in Mexico, where you have a lot of violence, and I was covering like murders, like of women and the violence, local violence. When I got back to Tijuana, I needed a week or so to, you know, like regain basically my balance. And what helped was the sea, like just, you know, trying to sleep and then walking on the beach and calm down. And what also helps me is doing, like, for example, like running, or I also do boxing. So this is for me like it's a way to release the negative energy and the stress, because you feel the stress sometimes in your body, you know, it adds up. And then I also, like, if I can't sleep, for example, I discovered that it helps me to search for poetry, like online, and kind of like finding something that has like, not necessarily positive, but some kind of like poetry that corresponds with my feeling at the day, and it kind of like helps me sleeping. In Mexico, the criminal activities are going on despite COVID-19. So there are some criminal organizations that even impose their own lockdowns, for example, like in informal settlements. So they threaten people to stay at home, to sometimes to wear masks, like depending on the situations, because they are threatened or feel threatened themselves. So it's also like auto-protection, basically. So if the people in the barrio, like the people in the region, keep themselves safe, like they also profit from that. The general crime levels, they were not reduced, because the cartels or the gangs still fight for turf. So there were a couple of massacres, the murders are going on, and also like there was a high-scale attack on the police chief of Mexico City, like during the pandemics. So they are just, you know, like kind of continuing their activities, and the fighting is going on, the conflicts. And then, for example, like the people in Tijuana or in other communities, like are of course impacted massively. And especially if you look at vulnerable communities like the migrants, they're basically like stuck in the border cities, because, you know, like Trump is still pushing people out despite the pandemics. And then like they can't move anywhere. On the other hand, the shelters are completely like, they can't even operate anymore, because you had cases where COVID spread quickly within the shelters, because people are cramped, of course. So they have nowhere to go. I think mindfulness and also like emotional education is super necessary, like especially if you live or grow up in environments with a high stress level, because basically you have resist the stress. And for example, imagine you live in a cramped little house with 6 kids, you know, like you're locked in because of the pandemics. Maybe you have a situation of domestic violence, and we can see this, like the figures for domestic violence are rising, have risen during the pandemics in the past month, like tremendously all over the world. Then you need coping strategies. And I think also, you know, a lot of the gangbanger behavior, it's very connected to macho attitudes, to basically like also like images that come from the outside, but also like from society. and you're kind of stereotyped and everything, but then it's also like becoming part of your self-image, or how you think you have to be or act on the streets to be respected. I think like showing alternatives to this kind of like mindset is pretty important to also like open up the imagination for a different future. I think it depends very much like on the country probably, but in general, like communities where people like share small spaces, they kind of like they've understood, or still, you know, like you understand basically that your safety, you know, and your well-being depends very much on the behavior, like directly on the behavior, on your neighbor, on the people that are surrounding you. I think this is something that the corona crisis, like the pandemics, taught the Western world again, that, you know, like your protection or your level of health and security is very much dependent on people close to you. And I think this is an interesting learning that we could probably like take away from the pandemics. What's interesting is like the tight-knit networks that you often see, and also that basically, you know, like in the Western world, you sometimes have these like imagination of policing solving every problem or taking care of everything. And we know that all over the world in many communities, policing doesn't work at all. Like sometimes they don't even come in, sometimes they don't care, sometimes they're even a threat for the people there. And basically there are a lot of like local initiatives where the neighbors, for example, are activated and or help themselves basically in situations of threat. For example, one example is in Ecuador, like the domestic violence was also rising during the pandemics, and the initiatives developed kind of an emoji system. So when you were in the situations of domestic violence at risk, you could send an emoji code, for example, I don't know, whatever, to this initiative, and they would sometimes, you know, like in a chain, like even if you live in a remote area, they would activate a local leader or your neighbors, and they would check at you in the emergency situation. In theory, you could extract knowledge, or you could extract stories with a lot of techniques, you know, like the police does, for example. But I think like what you really need is basically like a genuine interest for the people, not just extracting the stories, but really, you know, like being eager to learn something new, being eager to understand the perspectives, the situation. And I think then you, in the best case, like you can develop not just, you know, like a one-way interview, for example, but a discussion or something. And you learn, it's rewarding also, like for both sides. I think people can kind of detect like with which mindset you come, basically. They often trust you more if they can figure out what background you have, or that you have some kind of experience with the problems or challenges, you know, that you have maybe your own story that you also kind of share, like, so you have another level of trust. Stay safe at the moment, I would say. And basically, like, I hope, you know, like, I think a lot of people were forced to change their everyday behaviors and think about their life and so on, like in the past month of the pandemic, and the pandemic is still ongoing, you know. And I hope basically that people use these takeaways to really change their behavior, and not just, you know, because they perceive that the danger is kind of gone, which is untrue. That they just delve back into their old lives, you know, and live like they did before. And I hope, yeah, that a bit of this like community feeling, like the that we can take it as something, as some positive learning effect, because the pandemic showed that everything is interconnected. Like our safety depends on, you know, like how China or how Mexico or whatever, like other countries deal with this massive challenge. And also like thinking about like how we can support each other.
Thank you so much for these inspirational words and this and your time again.
Thanks.